Ethan Ward stood motionless in the hallway, a cardboard box pressed against his chest, watching three people in tailored suits walk into the glass-walled conference room to replace him. It wasn't the termination that made his throat tighten. It was the fact that he recognized all three of them. Owen Mercer, Clara Bennett, Miles Donovan. He had taught Owen how to read a distributed systems failure pattern before the alerts even fired. He had sat with Clara through her first live incident, walking her through every decision in real time. He had handed Miles his very first architecture diagram and told him to find what was missing. Every piece of expertise they were now being paid a fortune to bring into Helion DataWorks. He had put it there. CEO Celeste Monroe had just signed off on replacing him with his own students. She didn't know that. Nobody in that room knew that. And Nolan Pierce, the man who had engineered the whole arrangement, was making absolutely certain it stayed that way. Ethan shifted the box in his arms and kept walking. He already knew what was coming. He just didn't know how soon. If you're new here, this channel tells stories about quiet people who hold everything together while no one's watching. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Ethan Ward's alarm went off at 5:15 every morning, not because his job required it, but because Lily did. By the time the sun was fully up, he had already made breakfast, packed her lunch, checked her homework folder, and braided her hair into the lopsided ponytail. She insisted, looked perfect. He would drop her at school, watch her disappear through the front doors, and then drive to Helion DataWorks in the same worn jacket he'd owned for 4 years. To anyone watching, he was unremarkable. A mid-level maintenance technician who kept to himself, showed up on time, and spent most of his day in the server rooms on the lower floors. He didn't attend leadership meetings. He didn't give presentations. He had no direct reports and no corner office. His badge said Ethan Ward Infrastructure Maintenance, and most of his colleagues had never looked closely enough to wonder why someone with his quiet competence had settled for a role that asked so little of him. What they didn't know was that Ethan had built the thing they were all maintaining. 6 years earlier, he had been Helion DataWorks' lead systems architect, the person who designed HelionCore from the ground up. HelionCore was the company's central data platform, the backbone that served dozens of large enterprise clients across banking, logistics, and healthcare. Every routing layer, every failsafe, every undocumented exception handler that kept the system alive during edge cases, Ethan had written it, tested it, and in many cases invented it. Then his wife died. It wasn't sudden, but it was devastating in the way that slow losses always are, the kind that hollows you out gradually until one morning you realize you've been running on nothing for months. Sarah had been gone for 2 years when Ethan finally went to HR and asked to step down. He didn't want a leave of absence. He didn't want a reduced schedule. He wanted a role that let him be home at 6 o'clock, cook dinner, and read to his daughter before she fell asleep. The company obliged, quietly, and moved him into maintenance. His salary dropped, his title disappeared, and within 18 months, a full cycle of new hires had come through Helion DataWorks without ever learning who he was. Celeste Monroe arrived as the new CEO 8 months ago with a mandate to modernize. She was sharp, analytically precise, and genuinely good at identifying inefficiency. What she hadn't yet developed was an instinct for the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't show up in performance metrics, the kind that lives inside one person's head and walks out the door with them when they leave. The person she trusted most was Nolan Pierce, her chief operating officer. Nolan was polished, persuasive, and always had a clean narrative ready for every decision. What Celeste didn't know was that Nolan had his own history with Ethan, one that predated her arrival by years. They had competed for the lead architect position when Ethan was still in his prime. Ethan had gotten it. Nolan had not. He had spent the years since building a different kind of power, the administrative kind, and he had been patient about it in the way that people with long memories tend to be. When the opportunity finally arrived to restructure the technical department, Nolan didn't hesitate. He put together a report. Clean numbers, clean narrative. And at the center of it was a recommendation to eliminate one maintenance technician, whose contribution, according to the data, was minimal. The data, of course, had been very carefully selected. The restructuring proposal landed on Celeste's desk on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a vendor renewal summary and a quarterly infrastructure cost review. Nolan had timed it deliberately sandwiched between routine documents. It read like a routine decision. The report was thorough. It outlined the current technical staffing model, identified what Nolan described as redundancies in the maintenance tier, and proposed replacing a single low-output position with a 3-person specialized team. The new hires, Owen Mercer, Clara Bennett, and Miles Donovan, came with impressive credentials: Fortune 500 experience, advanced certifications, and a combined rate that Nolan justified with projected efficiency gains over the next 2 fiscal years. On paper, the math worked. What the report did not mention was that Ethan Ward had spent 3 years running an internal training program at Helion DataWorks. It did not mention that Owen, Clara, and Miles had all passed through that program early in their careers. It did not mention the architecture documentation Ethan had produced, the incident protocols he had written, or the fact that the platform they were all now being paid to modernize had been designed by the man being replaced. Those details existed in the company's internal records. Nolan had not deleted them. He was too careful for that. He had simply moved them into an archive subdirectory that required specific access permissions to reach, relabeled the folder with a date-coded string that meant nothing to anyone scanning a directory tree, and made sure the metadata pointed nowhere useful. The information was technically still there. It was just invisible to anyone who didn't already know to look for it. Celeste read the report, cross-referenced the cost projections, and signed the termination order. In the same meeting, she approved 2 other department changes. She asked one question: whether the transition timeline gave adequate handoff coverage. Nolan said yes. She moved on. She had no reason to doubt him. He hadn't given her one yet. Ethan received the news on a Thursday afternoon, not in a scheduled meeting, not from his direct supervisor, but from an HR representative who walked into the server room on sublevel 2 while Lily was sitting cross-legged in the corner, drawing in a sketchbook. School had let out early for a staff development day, and Ethan had brought her in rather than leave her with a neighbor on short notice. She was 6, and she had learned early to be quiet in the server rooms. She liked the hum of the machines. The HR representative handed Ethan a white envelope and explained, in the careful language HR departments use for these moments, that his position had been eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring, effective at the end of the business day. Ethan looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he looked at Lily, who had glanced up from her drawing, read the room with the particular sensitivity that children develop when they've lived through loss, and gone back to her sketchbook without a word. He turned back to the HR representative and asked one question: who's going to handle a state drift failure in server cluster 7 if it happens? The representative blinked. I'm sorry? Cluster 7, Ethan said, his voice even. There's a thermal compensation sequence embedded in the secondary monitoring process. It's not in the standard documentation. If the ambient temperature in the data hall spikes during a high-load period, the cluster needs that process to maintain state coherence. If someone removes it thinking it's redundant log output, the system will fail. Not immediately, but it will fail. He paused. I'm asking who knows about it. The representative had no answer. That wasn't her department. Ethan nodded once, slid the envelope into his jacket pocket, and began shutting down his workstation. He helped Lily pack her sketchbook into her backpack, took her hand and walked toward the elevator without raising his voice or looking back. He had said what needed to be said. Whether anyone had heard it was no longer his responsibility. The doors closed behind them. They were almost at the lobby when Ethan heard the conference room before he saw it. The glass-walled room off the main corridor was lit up, full of people, the kind of energy that comes with introductions and first impressions. Celeste was standing at the head of the table. Nolan was beside her, one hand gesturing toward a slide on the wall screen, and seated across from them in the chairs closest to the door were Owen Mercer, Clara Bennett, and Miles Donovan. Ethan slowed without meaning to. Owen was the one who noticed him first. The eye contact lasted less than 2 seconds, just long enough for something to shift in Owen's expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than that. Recognition, and beneath it, the particular discomfort of a person who understands exactly what they're looking at, but hasn't yet decided what to do about it. Then Nolan stepped slightly to the left, repositioning himself between Owen and the hallway window, and whatever moment might have existed closed before it could open. Celeste didn't look up. She was mid-sentence, pointing to something on the screen, fully inside the meeting. To her, the man passing by the glass with a cardboard box and a 6-year-old was simply part of the background motion of a normal workday, a departing employee. Unremarkable, already in the past tense. Ethan watched for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked down at Lily, who was watching a pigeon on the window ledge across the atrium with complete absorption. He could walk into that room. He had every right to. He could set the box down on the nearest surface, look Celeste Monroe in the eye, and explain, calmly and precisely, that the 3 specialists she had just hired were people he had trained, that their foundational knowledge of distributed systems, of incident response, of the specific architecture underpinning HelionCore, had come directly from him. He could pull up the internal training records on his phone. He could let the silence that followed do the rest. It would have been the truth, every word of it. But Lily's hand was in his, small and warm and trusting, and she had already been through one difficult morning, the HR visit, the early departure, the way the adults around her had spoken in careful voices that children always see through. She didn't need to watch her father stand in a hallway and fight for something he shouldn't have had to fight for at all. Some things, Ethan had decided long before today, were not worth doing in front of your child. He picked up the box with his free hand and kept walking. They took the elevator to the lobby. Outside, the afternoon was warm and faintly overcast. Lily spotted an ice cream cart 2 blocks down and looked up at him with an expression that asked the question without using words. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Let's do that." They walked to the cart. Lily chose strawberry. Ethan stood beside her on the sidewalk, cardboard box balanced under one arm, watching the foot traffic move past the entrance of the building he had just left for the last time. He wasn't angry. That surprised him a little. Mostly what he felt was something quieter than anger, the particular stillness of a person who has already understood what happened and is simply waiting to see how long it takes everyone else to understand it too. He already knew it wouldn't be long. The first 2 weeks went smoothly enough that Nolan sent Celeste a follow-up memo congratulating the team on a seamless transition. Owen, Clara, and Miles were not coasting. They worked long hours, asked sharp questions, and brought genuine expertise to the table. Clara restructured 3 monitoring dashboards within the first week, making the alert system cleaner and faster to read. Miles mapped out a dependency tree for HelionCore's routing layer that the previous documentation had never fully captured. Owen identified 6 processes running on legacy parameters that hadn't been updated in over 2 years. Celeste reviewed their progress reports and felt the particular satisfaction of a decision that appeared to be paying off. The numbers looked better. The systems looked more organized. The team was visible in a way that the previous maintenance model had never been. What none of the reports reflected was the difference between understanding a system's surface and understanding its interior. HelionCore had been built across 4 years of continuous iteration. It had survived 3 major client crises, 2 hardware failures, and 1 near-catastrophic data routing collapse that Ethan had resolved over a single weekend by writing a temporary patch directly into the system's core process stack. That patch had eventually become permanent. It was not documented as a patch. It was documented as nothing at all, because by the time Ethan had meant to write it up properly, his wife had been diagnosed, and the documentation had never happened. There were other things like that inside HelionCore. Decisions made under pressure that had calcified into architecture, workarounds that had become load-bearing walls. The system worked, reliably and well, but it worked the way old buildings work, not because every choice had been correct, but because the person who had made the choices also knew which ones couldn't be touched. Miles was the first to notice something he couldn't name. He was running a routine performance audit on the sublevel processing stack when he found a response pattern that didn't match the documented behavior. The system was compensating for something. He could see the output, but the input that should have triggered the compensation wasn't visible in the logs. He flagged it in his notes as a possible documentation gap and mentioned it to Clara during their end-of-day check-in. Clara looked at his notes, cross-referenced the relevant section of the technical manual, and concluded it was standard legacy drift, the kind of minor discrepancy that accumulated in any system that had been running long enough. She wasn't dismissive about it. She was methodical. She simply applied the most reasonable explanation available to her and moved on, filing Miles's concern away as something to revisit if it appeared again. She was not wrong to do that. She just didn't have the context to know that in this particular system, the most reasonable explanation was sometimes the wrong one. Owen found the process 3 days later. He was auditing server Cluster 7's resource allocation, one of the tasks Nolan had specifically highlighted as a priority, framing it as an opportunity to demonstrate the team's efficiency gains. In the secondary monitoring layer, Owen found a process that appeared to be running a continuous log operation with no clear output destination. It consumed a small but measurable share of processing resources every cycle. By every standard metric Owen had been trained to apply, it looked like redundant log output from an old monitoring script that had never been properly decommissioned. He pulled it up and reviewed it for 20 minutes. Then he called Clara over. She looked at it for 10 minutes and agreed with his initial read. They checked for any documentation referencing the process. There was none. Owen marked it as dead weight and removed it. He logged the change as a minor efficiency improvement and included it in that week's optimization report. Third item from the bottom. 1 line of description. Neither of them noticed that the process had been running on a conditional trigger, that it only became active when ambient temperature in the data hall exceeded a specific threshold in combination with a processing load above 70%. Neither of them had seen it in active state, because in the 2 weeks they had been working, the building's cooling system had held without issue. That night, Ethan was sitting at his kitchen table after Lily had gone to sleep, working through a document he had been building for the past 2 weeks. It was a complete operational guide for HelionCore, every undocumented process, every load-bearing workaround, everything he had never had the time or the reason to write down before. He wasn't sending it to anyone, not yet. He was writing it because it needed to exist. The heat advisory came through at 4 in the afternoon, an unusually early summer spike. Temperatures projected to hold through midnight. The building's facility manager sent a routine notification to the technical floor recommending additional monitoring of cooling systems in the data halls. Clara acknowledged the message, noted it in the team's shared log, and set an automated alert threshold for ambient temperature in the primary server room. It was a reasonable response. It was exactly what the protocol recommended. What the protocol didn't account for was that Cluster 7's cooling compensation worked differently from every other cluster in the building. Ethan had rebuilt it after a hardware failure 3 years earlier using a hybrid thermal management approach he had designed himself. It didn't rely solely on ambient temperature readings. It relied on a calculated ratio between ambient temperature, current processing load, and the state confirmation signal from the secondary monitoring process. The same process Owen had removed 6 days ago. Without that signal, the cluster had no way to locate itself within its own thermal compensation cycle. It knew it was hot. It didn't know what to do about it. At 11:47 p.m., the first error appeared, a minor data latency flag on Cluster 7's outbound routing. Miles was on the late monitoring shift. He saw it, checked the alert level, and cross-referenced it against the threshold chart. It read as a mid-level warning, well within the range that standard protocol classified as monitor and hold rather than immediate intervention. He logged it and kept watching. At 11:59, the latency flag escalated. At 12:04, Cluster 7 dropped its first routing table. At 12:09, the cascade began. HelionCore did not fail loudly. It failed the way complex systems always fail, in a sequence of small, interconnected collapses, each one triggering the next, moving faster than any single point of intervention could stop. By 12:15, 4 of Helion's largest enterprise clients had lost connectivity. By 12:20, the number was 11. By 12:30, it was 23. The banking clients couldn't process overnight transactions. The logistics clients lost real-time visibility on their vehicle fleets. The healthcare clients found their patient record synchronization frozen mid-transfer, which triggered automatic safety locks across 3 hospital networks. Celeste's phone rang at 12:31. She was in a car and on another call within 4 minutes. By the time she reached the office at 1:15, Owen, Clara, and Miles had been working the problem for 45 minutes. The conference room adjacent to the server floor had become a war room, laptops open, system dashboards pulled up on every screen, empty coffee cups accumulating on the table's edge. They had tried a full cluster restart. The system had come back up partially and then dropped again. They had attempted a routing table rollback to the previous stable state. The rollback had partially applied and then stalled, leaving HelionCore in a split-state condition that was worse than the original failure. Clara had initiated a failover to the backup system, which had absorbed partial load before flagging its own instability warnings. Every fix was making it worse. Celeste stood in the doorway and watched them work for 60 seconds without speaking. She had managed technical crises before in previous roles, and she knew the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when smart people have run out of ideas they're confident in. This was that silence. "Where are we?" she said. Owen turned around. He looked like someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and was beginning to feel it. "The system is in a split operational state. It thinks it's running 2 different recovery modes simultaneously. Every time we push a correction into one mode, the other mode interprets it as a new failure event and responds accordingly." He paused. "We can't find the origin point. How long until we breach the service agreements? 4 hours. Maybe less, depending on how the split state progresses." Celeste looked at the screens. Then she looked at Nolan, who was standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, already composing the version of events in which this outcome had nothing to do with his restructuring proposal. She looked away from him. Miles had not spoken since Celeste arrived. He had been sitting very still in front of his laptop, not typing, just staring at a single screen. Now he said quietly, to no one in particular, "This isn't something we can read in the documentation." The room went still. The system is behaving like something was removed, that it depended on, Miles continued. Something that isn't listed anywhere. Which means someone built something into this platform that they never wrote down. He looked up, and that person isn't in this room. Owen sat back in his chair. He knew exactly who Miles was talking about. He had known since the moment the cascade started, maybe earlier. Maybe since the moment he had seen Ethan walking through the hallway with a cardboard box and had looked away. He reached for his phone. He had removed Ethan's contact after the transition, telling himself it was routine housekeeping. He scrolled through his old call history until he found a number from a voicemail, and he dialed. It rang twice. "Ethan," Owen said. "I need your help." The line was quiet for a moment after Owen spoke, not the quiet of someone who had been asleep. Though it was nearly 2 in the morning, it was the quiet of someone who had been awake, waiting, and was now simply deciding how to respond. "Is it Cluster 7? Ethan asked. Owen closed his eyes. "Yes. Has it lost state coherence?" "We think so. We can't confirm because the secondary monitoring process isn't running." It wasn't a question. Someone removed it. Owen didn't answer immediately. Across the room, Clara had stopped typing. Miles was watching him from the other side of the table. "I did," Owen said. "I thought it was redundant log output. There was no documentation indicating it was." "I know," Ethan said. "That's my fault. I never finished the write-up." A pause. "How bad is the split state?" "Bad. Every correction we push triggers a secondary failure response. We've made it worse 3 times in the last hour. Stop pushing corrections. We can't just..." "Owen," Ethan's voice was calm and exact. In the way that people become calm when the situation has clarified rather than worsened. Every intervention you're making is being interpreted by 2 competing recovery processes as a new failure event. You're feeding the loop. Stop. All active remediation. Let the system sit in the split state. It will not improve on its own, but it will stop degrading. Then don't touch anything until I get there." Owen looked at Clara. She had been leaning forward slightly, listening. She straightened up and gave a single tight nod. "Okay," Owen said. "But, Ethan, I need you to come in." "I'll come in," Ethan said, "but not to talk to you." A brief silence. "I need to speak directly with Celeste Monroe." Owen hadn't expected that. "I can relay whatever you need her to know. You don't have to." "This isn't about what I need her to know tonight," Ethan said. "It's about what she needs to understand before tomorrow and the day after that. If I walk in there and fix the system and walk out again, nothing changes. The same decisions get made, the same things get buried, the same people get removed because a report said they were low value." He paused. "I'm not negotiating. I'm explaining. If she wants me in that building tonight, she gets on the phone and asks me herself." Owen stood up, crossed to where Celeste was standing near the window, and held out his phone without a word. Celeste looked at it for a moment, then she took it. "Mr. Ward," she said. "This is Celeste Monroe." "I know who you are," Ethan said. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, but before I come in, I want you to know something. I'm not coming because I want something from you. I'm coming because 23 companies are losing money right now, and 3 hospital networks have frozen record transfers. I'm coming because the system needs to be fixed, and I'm the only person who can fix it tonight." A brief pause. "But when it's done, I want 10 minutes. Just the 2 of us. Not to negotiate, not to make demands. Just to tell you what actually happened and let you decide what to do with it." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Behind her, Nolan shifted his weight. "Agreed," she said. "One more thing," Ethan said. "The man who put together the restructuring report, keep him in the building." He ended the call. Ethan was in Lily's doorway for 30 seconds before he left. She was asleep on her side, one arm draped over the edge of the mattress, her sketchbook open on the nightstand to a drawing she'd been working on, a house with a very large tree in front, and 2 figures standing underneath it. He pulled her door to, not fully closed, the way she liked it. Then, he sent a text to his neighbor, asking if she could come sit in the apartment explained there was a work emergency, and apologized for the hour. Her reply came in under a minute. Already up. Be there in 2. Ethan put on his jacket and went downstairs to wait. Celeste was standing outside the server room when Ethan arrived. She had positioned herself there deliberately. He realized, not inside with the team, not back in the conference room running logistics, but here, at the threshold, as if she had understood that this moment required her presence in a way the previous ones had not. She looked at him, the way people look at someone they are seeing clearly for the first time after a long period of looking without seeing. There was no embarrassment in it, or not only embarrassment, there was the particular expression of a person recalibrating in real time. "Mr. Ward," she said. "Ethan," he said, "let's go in." The server room was louder than usual, cooling units running at maximum. The ambient hum elevated to something closer to a roar. The screens along the monitoring wall showed a landscape of red and amber indicators, a system that had been pushed in too many directions at once and was now holding very still in its own confusion. Ethan set his bag down, pulled a chair to the primary workstation, and looked at the status display for 90 seconds without speaking. Owen stood to his left. Clara and Miles were positioned slightly behind, close enough to follow everything, far enough to stay out of the way. Then, Ethan said, "It's worse than I thought." No one spoke. The 3 rollback attempts created layered state conflicts. The system isn't just split. It's split across 3 recovery checkpoints, each one partially applied. It thinks it failed at 3 different moments, and it's trying to respond to all of them simultaneously. He leaned forward, enlarging one section of the status display. The routing data is still intact. That's the one piece of good news. But the path back to a stable state is very narrow, and it has to be executed in a specific sequence. If any single step is applied out of order, we lose the routing tables entirely, Clara said, carefully. What happens if we lose the routing tables? Full system rebuild from backup. Minimum 72 hours of downtime. Every client contract with a 4-hour SLA provision goes into breach simultaneously. Ethan pulled up a secondary screen. Estimated liability exposure, somewhere between $80 and $120 million, depending on how the healthcare network delays are classified. The room absorbed that number in silence. Nolan had positioned himself near the back wall, slightly apart from the group, the way people stand when they are calculating exits, he said. The 3-person team was given a non-standard system with inadequate documentation. That's an inherited risk, not a. Nolan. Celeste said it once, quietly, and he stopped. She hadn't looked away from the monitoring screen. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has made a decision and is no longer interested in the conversation around it. Ethan glanced back at Nolan, once not with anger, but with the brief, assessing look of someone confirming that a variable they had already accounted for was behaving exactly as predicted. Then he turned back to the screen. "I need everyone to understand what we're about to do," he said, addressing Owen, Clara, and Miles directly. "I'm going to walk through every step before I execute it, not because I need help, but because when this is over, you 3 are the ones who have to keep this system running. So, pay attention, not to the crisis, to the reasoning behind each decision." He paused. "You've been working from the documentation. After tonight, you'll understand why the documentation was never enough." Clara opened her laptop without being asked and pulled up a blank document. Miles uncapped a pen. Owen said nothing. He was watching Ethan with an expression that had moved past guilt into something more complicated, the look of someone being shown the full dimensions of a debt they had previously underestimated. Celeste stood to the side, out of the direct work circle, watching all of it. She had spent 8 months learning this company's financials, its client relationships, its competitive positioning. She had read hundreds of internal reports. She had sat through dozens of briefings. None of it had shown her this a man who had built the entire foundation of her company's operations. who had been classified as low value and discarded based on information deliberately shaped to produce exactly that conclusion, now sitting in a server room at 2:30 in the morning, calmly preparing to save the thing that had let him go. She thought about the report she had signed without a second question. She thought about the meeting she had finished in 7 minutes. She thought about the man she had watched walk through the lobby with a cardboard box and a 6-year-old, and how she had not once wondered who he was. Ethan started at the bottom, not metaphorically, literally. The lowest layer of HelionCore's process stack, the foundational state registry that every other system component reported to. If the recovery was going to hold, it had to be anchored here first, before anything above it was touched. The system right now believes it is simultaneously in 3 states, he said, pulling up the registry display: pre-failure, mid-recovery, and post-recovery. Each state has its own set of active processes, responding to what it thinks is the current condition. They're contradicting each other in real time, which is why every external intervention has been interpreted as a new failure event. He pointed to 3 separate process clusters on the screen. Before I can restore routing functionality, I have to collapse these 3 states into one, and I have to do it without triggering the automated recovery response that will fire if the system detects what it classifies as an unauthorized state change. Miles looked up from his notes. How do you prevent it from detecting the change? You don't prevent it, Ethan said. You make the change slowly enough that the detection threshold never crosses the alert trigger. The system is looking for rapid state shifts. A gradual one reads as normal operational drift. He glanced at the temperature display on the side panel, which is also why timing matters. The thermal compensation cycle runs on a 90-second interval. Every command I enter has to land inside that window, not across it. If a command straddles 2 cycles, the system registers a timing inconsistency and treats it as a hardware fault. Clara had stopped being defensive approximately 15 minutes into the explanation. It had happened gradually. Each clarification Ethan offered revealed another layer of the system she hadn't known existed. And at a certain point, the accumulated weight of that became impossible to argue against. She was now writing faster than Miles, her earlier posture of professional certainty replaced by the focused attention of someone who has decided that understanding matters more than being right. She said, "The thermal window is that why the failure happened at night. The cooling load during peak daytime hours would have masked the missing process." Ethan looked at her. Yes, exactly. During the day, the building's WAC runs at full capacity, and the temperature variance stays within normal range. The process only activates above a specific threshold. Last night was the first time since the process was removed that conditions triggered the threshold. He paused. You were looking in the right direction earlier, Clara. Your alert threshold was correct. You just didn't have the information to know what the alert was actually telling you. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," Ethan said. "There's a difference." He began entering the first sequence of commands. The room settled into a rhythm of near silence, broken only by keystrokes and the steady roar of the cooling units. Owen stood close enough to follow every input, occasionally asking a short question that Ethan answered without breaking his pace. Miles documented each step in real time. Clara monitored the secondary display, calling out temperature readings and load percentages at each 90-second interval. At 3:17, the first state conflict resolved. A single cluster of the contradictory processes collapsed into the baseline registry. The monitoring wall shifted not dramatically, several red indicators moving to amber, 2 amber ones going briefly to yellow before stabilizing. Small changes, but Ethan exhaled slightly, which was the closest thing to visible relief anyone in the room had seen from him. 1 down, Miles said quietly. 2 to go, Ethan said, and kept typing. At 3:41, Celeste stepped away from her position near the wall and walked to the far side of the room, where Nolan was still standing. Owen, watching from the corner of his vision, saw her take out her phone, open something on the screen, and hold it out toward Nolan without speaking. Nolan looked at the screen. He recognized it immediately, the archive subdirectory, the access logs, timestamps that showed exactly when the files had been moved and which credentials had been to moved them. His expression didn't collapse. He was too controlled for that. But something in his posture changed the particular stillness of a person who has just watched their last viable position close off. "You can say whatever you want to say right now," Celeste said, her voice low and even. "Or you can wait for the formal process either way." "I've seen enough." Nolan said nothing. He set his badge on the edge of the nearest desk and walked to the door. No confrontation, no final argument. Just the quiet exit of a man who had always known, somewhere, that patience could run out on both sides. Ethan, without turning around, said, "Third subdirectory under the Legacy Archive folder. The access log will show you when the files were moved and what credentials were used." Celeste looked at the back of his head. "You found it while you were logged into the network tonight." "My old service account was still active," Ethan said. "It hadn't been deprovisioned in the transition. I found it when I needed to pull the original system specs." He entered another command, watched the system's response, entered a correction. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it right now. Finish the crisis first. Everything else can wait until morning." At 4:08, the second state conflict resolved. At 4:23, Ethan entered the final sequence, a 17-step manual reinitialization of Cluster 7's thermal compensation framework. Rebuilt from memory, each step timed to the 90-second window that Clara was now tracking with the precision of someone who had fully internalized why it mattered. At 4:31, the third conflict collapsed. The routing tables reappeared on the primary display, intact, every entry in place. HelionCore's main processing layer flickered, stabilized, and began restoring client connections in the order of service agreement priority banking networks first, then logistics, then healthcare synchronization, each one coming back online in the steady, unhurried sequence of a system that had found its footing again. The monitoring wall went from red to amber to yellow to green, one section at a time, until the whole display held a color that nobody in the room had seen for nearly 5 hours. Ethan sat back in his chair. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, after the last indicator turned green. Not the tense quiet of before the held breath quiet of people waiting for the next thing to break. This was different. This was the quiet that follows the end of something, when the body hasn't yet caught up with the fact that the emergency is over. Owen was the first to move. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair, put both elbows on the table, and pressed his hands over his face. Not dramatic, just tired and relieved, and carrying something he hadn't finished processing yet. Miles closed his notebook. He looked at the pages he had filled over the past 2 hours, dense, careful notes, diagrams, sequences, annotations in the margins where something Ethan had said had connected to something he had previously misunderstood. He set the pen down on top of it with the deliberate care of someone placing something they intend to return to. Clara closed her laptop, stood up, and walked directly to where Ethan was sitting. "I owe you an apology," she said. No preamble, no softening. "I looked at that process, and I made a judgment based on incomplete information, and I defended that judgment when Miles flagged that something wasn't right. I should have asked more questions before I agreed with Owen's assessment." She paused. "The documentation gap was yours, but the decision to remove the process without further investigation was mine. I'm not going to put that on the paperwork." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "Apology accepted," he said. "For what it's worth, the way you tracked those thermal windows tonight is exactly the kind of instinct this system needs. You just needed to know what you were listening for." Clara nodded once, tightly, and stepped back. Owen lowered his hands from his face. He didn't stand up. He looked at Ethan from across the table with the expression of a person who has been rehearsing something and has decided to stop rehearsing and simply say it. "You taught me everything I knew when I walked into my first real incident," he said. "I knew it was you in that hallway. I saw you and I made a choice not to say anything because the situation was." He started again. "There's no version of that I can justify. I'm sorry, Ethan." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You were put in a position you didn't engineer," he said finally. "I don't hold you responsible for Nolan's decisions, but I do think you knew, when you saw me leaving, that something was wrong. And next time you know something is wrong," he let the sentence finish itself. Owen nodded. "I know," Miles said from across the room. "I'd like to learn the full architecture. From the beginning, not from the documentation, if you're willing." "We'll see," Ethan said. Celeste had been standing near the monitoring wall through all of it, giving the conversation the space it needed. When it reached its natural pause, she crossed the room and stopped a few feet from Ethan. 10 minutes, she said. "You asked for 10 minutes. They moved to the small office, adjacent to the server floor, a glass-walled room with a table and 4 chairs used for shift handoffs and vendor calls. Celeste closed the door. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at him with the directness of someone who has decided that anything less than complete honesty would be an insult to the situation. "I signed the termination order in 7 minutes, she said. "I didn't ask a single question about who you were or what you'd built. I read a number in a column. I looked at 3 impressive resumes. And I made a decision I thought was straightforward." She paused. "It wasn't straightforward. It was careless, and I'm responsible for it. Not Nolan, not the report me. I signed it." Ethan said nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I'd like you to come back," Celeste said, "not to the maintenance role. I want to offer you the position of Chief Infrastructure Officer. Full authority over system architecture, documentation, technical training, and personnel evaluation for the engineering division. You would report directly to me." She held his gaze. "I'm also opening a formal internal investigation into Nolan's conduct. Starting this morning, his access has already been suspended." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "The investigation," he said. "Make sure it covers the archive folder manipulation, not just the restructuring report. The report was the surface. The archive is where the intent lives." "It will." He nodded slowly. Then he looked out through the glass wall at the server floor, where Owen, Clara, and Miles were still sitting tired, quieter than they had been in weeks, recalibrated in ways that would take time to fully settle. "I'll think about it," he said. Celeste started to say something, then didn't. "That's a real answer," Ethan said. "Not a negotiation. I need to think about what's right for me and for Lily. I'll give you an answer in a few days." He picked up his bag. "I still need to get her to school this morning." The sky was turning gray at the edges when Ethan walked out of Helion DataWorks. Not the flat gray of overcast, the particular pale gray that comes just before color returns to the world, when night has finished its business and morning hasn't fully committed yet. The street was quiet. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A woman walked a dog past the building entrance without looking up. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, bag over one shoulder, and breathed the early air. Then he took out his phone and sent a text to his neighbor. "On my way back. Thank you. I owe you dinner." He took a cab. The driver had the radio on low, a talk station. Voices murmuring about nothing urgent. Ethan sat in the back and watched the city move past the window in the unhurried way it moves at 5 in the morning, when it belongs briefly to the people who clean it and stock it and keep it running before everyone else arrives to use it. He thought about Celeste's offer. Chief Infrastructure Officer, full authority, report directly to the top. It was, objectively, everything his role had once been and more. It was also the thing he had walked away from 5 years ago, not because he had stopped caring about the work, but because the work had stopped being the most important thing. He thought about what it would mean in practical terms, the hours, the weight of it, the kind of presence the role would require. He thought about school pickups and dinner and the lopsided ponytail he braided every morning. He thought about the document he had been building at his kitchen table over the past 2 weeks, the complete operational guide for HelionCore. Every undocumented process laid out in plain language, the load-bearing workarounds finally given names and explanations. He had written it because it needed to exist. But sitting in the back of a cab at 5 in the morning, he understood something else about it. He had also written it because he still cared. Not about the company, not about the title, but about the work itself, about systems that held together, about knowledge that didn't disappear when a person walked out of a room. That was still in him. It had never left. He didn't have an answer yet. But he knew it was a real question, and that was different from where he had been 3 days ago. He was home by 5:40. His neighbor was asleep on the couch, under a blanket she had pulled from the closet. The television on mute. A half-finished cup of tea on the coffee table. Ethan covered her with a second blanket from the hall closet and went to the kitchen. He made pancakes from scratch Lily's preference, the kind with blueberries folded into the batter. Slightly thick, slightly uneven in the pan, the way she liked them, because she said the uneven ones tasted better. He had never been able to determine whether she actually believed that, or whether she had decided early on that it was the right thing to say to a father who was still learning to cook, without someone beside him. Either way, he made them uneven. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:50, hair loose, one sock on, holding her sketchbook against her chest. She looked at the pancakes on the stove and then at her father, and then back at the pancakes. "Did something happen?" she asked, because she was 6 and perceptive and had inherited, apparently, the ability to read a room. "Something happened," Ethan said, "but it's okay now. Sit down." She climbed into her chair. He set a plate in front of her 3 pancakes, blueberries, a small pour of maple syrup, not too much. She picked up her fork and began to eat, and told him about a dream she'd had involving a talking elevator and a horse that was also somehow a librarian. Ethan sat across from her, coffee in hand, and listened. His phone lit up on the counter, behind him Celeste's name on the screen. A formal offer sent by email, the subject line clean and direct. He didn't reach for it. He had a few days, and right now, the horse librarian's story was getting to the good part. The next day, Celeste suspended Nolan pending a full investigation, restored Ethan's record, and a company-wide meeting to address how Helion DataWorks evaluated the people quietly holding its systems together. Owen, Clara, and Miles requested to be part of the training program Ethan would build if he came back. Whether he did is a decision that belonged to him alone. But here's what this story is really about. There are people in every workplace, maybe in yours, who don't have impressive titles, who don't speak up in meetings, who just show up and keep things running, and most of the time, nobody knows how much depends on them until the moment they're gone. Ethan never needed a room full of people to tell him he was valuable. He already knew. That's what made him walk out with his head up, make pancakes for his daughter, and wait calmly, without bitterness for the world to catch up. Don't be the organization that has to lose the lights to realize who kept them on. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We tell more stories like this one every week. And if you know someone who works hard without getting enough credit, share this with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a person is simply say, "I see you."